What is the most WTF thing you've experienced seen during a flight? I had just got out of prison and was on my way home. I had just found out that my wife, who waited for me the whole time I was in prison, had just died in car accident right before I was due to be released. So I'm on the plane and this creepy old guy in a pale suit keeps talking to me like he knows me. He keeps trying to offer me a job but he won't tell me anything about what he actually does. Or even his real name. But he knew my name. And he knew things about me that he couldn't have known. Anyway, our plane was grounded by a storm and I ditched the guy because he was creeping me out. Got off and decided to rent a car and drive the rest of the way home. I know he didn't get off the plane because he was sleeping when I left. And I watched. Nobody else got off the plane after me. On my way home, I randomly stop in some town to get something to eat at a bar. And who is there waiting for me? That same creepy old man. You can't explain that. Was on a flight from Toronto to Thunder Bay, Ontario back in 2009. We were halfway there and flying near Sault Ste. Marie. And it was nighttime. I'm looking out my window and I see aircraft lights way off in the distance. Getting bigger. I ask the guy next to me to look out the window and tell me if I'm crazy. But nope. He sees them too. We're flying at 30,000 feet. And we both watch as slowly the lights get bigger. And bigger. It's a jet. And it's coming right for us. Neither of us truly believe it's gonna hit. I mean, the ATC can't be that stupid, right? After a few seconds, I'm not so sure. And I grit my teeth. The plane gets close enough to ours that I can see into its cabin windows. And it flies directly beneath us. Less than 500 feet for sure. The turbulence of it flying below us shakes our plane. Neither the captain nor flight attendants never mention a thing. Freaked me right the hell out. On a flight from Minneapolis to LA, I had quite a terrifying experience. I was sitting next to an elderly man who, partway through the flight, needed to use the restrooms. I moved aside and watched as he walked to the front of the plane attempting to find the restrooms. As he reached the front of the plane, I noticed he wasn't exactly headed towards the restrooms. Rather he was headed toward the front exit door. Horrified as I was, he began to attempt to open the front exit at 34,000 feet. He began to pull down on the lever to release the door when a flight attendant ran over to him and stopped him. She kindly redirected him towards the restrooms. A few years ago me and a few friends were flying from London to NY. When we were about to land it was completely dark outside. And at this point we were pretty sleep deprived and kind of nervous. Never having been to the US before. Anyway, the in-plane lights are turned off and the plane lands. As the plane comes to a halt on the runway, we notice a weird orange flickering glow illuminating the inside of the plane through the right-hand windows. Everyone looks out. And there's a wrecked airplane in the center of a huge fucking fire right next to us on the runway. The aircrew flat out ignored it and acted as if nothing was wrong. And we never found out what the hell happened. In the state of mind we were in, it was a very surreal experience. Years ago, flying from Dallas, woman in the seat behind me has a screaming kid with her. I put on noise cancelling headphones and turn up the volume. All is improved until I smell something truly gagging. For unknown reasons I pull the headphones off just in time to hear her ask the brat, "Make a little mud?" Double quote. I know Texas has some quaint phrases, but that one was the understatement of the decade. The kid had filled its diaper in the plane with some really toxic shit odor. I'd like to tell you she took the child to the bathroom and cleaned up. But, like the screaming, she didn't mind and the rest of us didn't matter. Long time lurker and I finally have something to post. So here goes. I was on a flight back to Pittsburgh from LA. In coach of course. I board the plane. Sit down and I notice two nurses helping an elderly woman into the seat directly in front of me. She was in a wheelchair and looked to have suffered a pretty bad stroke. About 30 minutes outside of Pittsburgh the woman shit herself. And the smell was god-awful. Then the nurses get up and actually changed her fucking diaper right in front of me. The smell instantly doubled when it hit the air, and it was at that point I actually prayed to God to knock that fucking plane out of sky and end it. Which he didn't, as I imagine he was laughing his ass off. I was on a flight from the East Coast to Arizona. In the middle of the flight the pilot gets on the intercom and is like, "Is anyone a doctor on the plane?" There was a lady like 3 rows up from me on the right section who had an oxygen tank and her family is all around her. I didn't think anything of it since it just seemed like she was just sick. 20 minutes later, the pilot gets on the intercom and is like, "We are diverting and making a stop in Denver." We land in Denver probably going 600 miles an hour. I have never gotten to the gate that fast in my life. After the door opened there was police, firefighters, EMT, you name it. You couldn't really see what was going on since there was so much commotion. I remember the family got off the plane with the lady. I specifically remember the look on passenger on my right when she looked out the window and saw there was a white sheet over the woman that was 3 rows up. She died on the plane. So you wonder, if someone dies on a plane, what happens? They land the plane, get the body off the plane and do some paperwork, and you are on your way in 30 minutes. The kicker to the story is in Denver it was during spring break, so they had a lot of overbooked passengers. The pilot gets on the intercom and says they are letting people from Denver board the plane since we had a few empty seats. Mind you, we were coming from the East Coast. Sure enough, a lady sat down in the same seat that the woman just died in. They didn't even clean IT. I could not believe it. I was in awe for the rest of the flight. I was thinking about telling the woman after the flight that someone died in her seat 20 minutes before, but I figured if that was me, I wouldn't want to know. My uncle is a mountain climber. He summited Everest a few years ago, and a couple months ago was climbing Street Elbrus in Russia. He summits Street Elbrus successfully and goes to the Moscow airport to fly back to Canada. After everyone had boarded the plane, a Chechnyan man runs to the front and tells everyone that he has a bomb attached to him that he will blow up unless the Russian government lets Chechnyan prisoners go. My uncle is at the back of the plane confused as to what is going on because he only speaks English. After 5 hours many people had fainted because the plane was not on and therefore air conditioning was not on. This was during a heat wave also. So the terrorist allows doctors to come aboard to help the sick people. However, instead of doctors it was the Russian equivalent of a SWAT team that kicked the living shit out of the man. After this everyone was deplaned and my uncle was stuck in the airport for an additional 16 hours being questioned by the Russian officials, without being allowed to call the Canadian embassy. And the airport didn't call the embassy either. He eventually came home with a sick story. TLDR. My uncle was on a Russian plane when a Chechenian terrorist held the plane hostage for 5 hours. On a flight from London to Berlin, me and my wife were the only passengers on board. It was kind of awesome. The flight attendants were in a wicked mood and loaded us up with drinks, and the pilot addressed us by name on all announcements. Halfway through the flight the plane's engines went dead silent and the flight attendant got a worried look on her face and said, "I fucking hate it when they do this." I wasn't really sure what was going on, but we figured the plane was gliding or something. I've never heard a plane be that quiet before. Anyways, we got insanely drunk and partied with one of the attendants later that night at Berghain Panorama Bar. Good times. I ended up sitting next to some cougar in first class where she proceeded to take advantage of the free drink and get completely smashed and hit on me heavily. She even got up during takeoff to use the restroom. She was basically climbing up the aisle since the plane was still ascending. 2 minutes later, she comes back with significantly more cleavage. It was so awkward. I tried my hardest to just listen to music and look out the window. She eventually moved on and got into this loud political debate with the people in the back row. Then this obese, flamboyant gay man in front of me angrily gets up out of his seat, turns around, gets into the aisle. He proclaims loudly in the most lispy voice I've ever heard. Hello, lady. This is not a public debate. Would you please shut up, as some of us are trying to sleep. Double quote. She then silently sat back down. It was awesome. On a red eye from SLC. A young mother sits in the aisle seat with her infant in the row I'm in. She's chunky and hippie-ish and pleasant enough. The seat between us was then filled by another mother. This one easily in her 80s. Who was traveling with a dozen of her children, grandchildren, GRT grandchildren, Mormons. Of course everyone within sight of an infant immediately feels anxiety at the prospect of an overnighter with a child who is sure to wail non-stop. So we take off. And the young mother proceeds to envelope her baby. Holding the child close in against her ample bosom and curling over her him and cooing and talking softly. This goes on for at least 4 hours. And the baby barely makes a peep. Maybe once it starts to get upset and the mother redoubles her efforts and the baby settles down again. At the end of the flight, the mother receives accolades for her baby handling skills from nearly every passenger around her. TL. Doctor, I took a 4-hour red-eye with an infant in my row. And said infant never cried or otherwise disturbed another passenger for the flight's duration. I was once on a flight with a steward who was an extremely flaming douchebag. Every time someone asked him to do anything you could tell he was pissed off and gave them attitude. He didn't say anything but he would let out sighs or look around as if to say, "Is this guy serious? How dare he ask me to do something for him?" About 3 hours into the flight someone was able to tape a "Kick me" sign onto his back. He then walked around the airplane for the next half hour while people behind him were snickering the whole time. It was hilarious. Even the other crew members on the plane were laughing at him when he couldn't see them. Eventually some old lady ruined everyone's fun and told him about it. He looked furious. Stupid old people always ruining everyone's fun. On a flight from Belfast to Birmingham, a lady boards after I was seated and asks if I would hold her baby whilst she got settled in. I said okay. A few minutes pass and the mother doesn't return. I call for a flight attendant who brings one of those orange belts and tells me to strap the baby onto me as they would be taking off soon. I protest quite loudly, "This is not my baby. It belongs to some woman back there." The FA insists I strap it in. After claiming that I was the dad and was trying to plan the baby off onto my wife, I spend the flight attached to a strange baby and with a sore neck as I kept looking round for the mother. Upon landing I see the lady chatting with the FAs and it becomes clear that she works for the airline. She had placed an airline ID badge around her neck, so that's how I knew. She takes the baby from me and sarcastically thanks me for offering to look after him. Not knowing what else to say, I lied and told her that I was the worst person to pull that stunt on as I was a social worker and that she would be getting a home visit pretty soon. Her face went a bit white at that point. I did actually call Birmingham Social Services to report the incident, but I never heard back from them. Not sure it was WTF, but it was amusing. As soon as seatbelts light went off, this businessman grabs his bag and off to the toilet he goes. Comes back a few minutes later wearing silk pyjamas and slippers. Has his suit in a garment bag. Gives it to stewardess who goes to hang it up. He puts on eye mask and off to sleep. He went for the whole flight. 6 hours. Wakes up, reverses procedure. Nice suit. Pressed shirt from his bag and such. I was kind of jealous. I'd love to be able to sleep in a plane like that. My mom was a flight attendant and had lots of crazy stories. One time, she was serving drinks and a passenger looks at her and says nervously, "The engine is on fire." My mom looked out the window and the engine was really on fire. She calmly told the man she will speak to the pilot. Really? She was shitting bricks. She goes into the cabin and tells the pilot the engine is on fire. The pilot looks at it, says, "It's okay. Just excess fuel burning up." To this day, my mother doesn't know if he was telling the truth. And quite frankly, doesn't want to know. A fake sense of security is better than no sense of security. On a United flight from LA to DC. The flight was a continuing flight from Mexico City, but with a new flight crew. Drink cart came out, and an overly blonde flight attendant asked what we wanted. We ordered, and she moved past us a bit and asked the people behind us what they wanted. The woman answered in Spanish, and before her adult son next to her could translate, the FA snapped, "English. This is America. We speak English. I won't give you anything unless you ask for it in English." Everyone went fun, except my husband, who pulled his headphones off and said loudly to me, "What the fuck? Did she just tell that woman to speak in English because it's America? That's fucking ridiculous. Did that really just happen? He continued on for a bit. And the files went mute and tried to get the cart down to the back as quickly as they could. They didn't give our row the time of day the rest of the flight. And yes, as we got off he made a big deal about getting her name and he called United. Close bracket. On a flight back from Hawaii, the row in front of me contained a bearded guy who looked about 40 and a Japanese woman who looked about 60. It was dark and the cabin lights were off. They began chatting. Soon I noticed that they were each leaning in toward the unoccupied middle seat and sort of whispering. I heard her say, "But I'm married," a bunch of times. She showed him her ring and he took her hand in his. They fondled each other's hands for a while. Occasionally she'd scold him and they'd talk some more. But soon they were fondling hands again. I hear her say, "But I don't know you." Soon the guy took out his driver's license and gave it to her to inspect, which she did for upwards of 10 minutes. When she was done he leaned in for a kiss. They made out for a while, about 40 minutes, and they stopped BC. She once again said that she was married, though this time she said it with a tiny bit of a smile. Her heart was clearly pounding. There was an electricity that overtook her. He was magnetized and focused on her every movement. When the plane landed they both rushed off together down the aisle toward the exit. The guy was on my next flight and I noticed that when he boarded the plane he had a red rose with him. The woman was nowhere to be seen. Not on a plane, but in the security line. About 6 years back, while about 10 people in front of my family in the line, a guy runs past the metal detector. It goes off. He doesn't stop. I couldn't tell what one of the security men yelled, but he yelled it 3 times. Instead of stopping the guy, all the guards and people behind the desks run into 2 rooms and close the doors, leaving all us passengers standing there freaking the fuck out. A minute or 2 pass. A ding goes over the PA system. Everyone comes out of the rooms. PA system says, "Thanks for being cooperative during our drill. And have a nice day." Double quote. TLDR. Apparently the drill is to leave all the passengers to die while the staff remains safe at airport check-ins. I used to internationally travel a lot when I was younger and working for a telecom company designing new infrastructure. On one of the trips as we were heading to China, I looked out the window. We were above Alaska and the Bering Strait somewhere, and the horizon had a huge slice of black, like some weird wedge-shaped cloud that encompassed half the horizon. It was a bright day on the ground or sea below us. The ice was very bright and white, but there was this giant dark wedge encompassing and seeming to take over the earth as you looked out to the horizon. I had the guys next to me look out and take a look. They were confused at first too. I was really confused for a few minutes. Then I realized what I was looking at in profile and what that engulfing black wedge really was. It was night. We were flying in such a manner that we were surfing the edge of daytime and nighttime at 35,000 plus FT, and at that moment if you looked out over the horizon you saw daytime fading into night. I only saw that once. It was being in the right place at the right time. I have a picture somewhere I may be able to dig up. Aside from bad in-flight movies, that would be my most WTF experience. It wasn't really a WTF moment for me, but for the guy next to me flying home from Amsterdam. I was pregnant and had the window seat, and the only open seat on the plane was next to me. Well, some drunk asshole was in front of me and a young Dutch guy next to him. The drunk had already fought with the flight attendants to serve him more drinks when he was clearly drunk. But to be more of an ass, he continuously got up and down out of his seats to get into the overhead compartments, trampling the Dutch guy each time. Then he drenched the guy in beer and soaked his seat too. I offered to let the guy sit next to me, warning him I was pregnant. Poor thing. I spent the next 8 hours crying at random and throwing up into bath bags. He had to keep getting up and stealing other people's bags too. He was sweet and sympathetic, but when it finally seemed to stop, the flight attendant didn't come to get the full bag right away and I dropped it on the floor. It exploded all over both of us and our stuff. Needless to say, I was sorry and felt bad, but we spent the last 2 hours and a transfer flight covered in bath. It was his first trip to the States. Welcome to America. On a flight a few weeks ago, the flight attendants started to make preparations for landing, telling people to put their trays up and whatnot. I noticed the flight attendant loudly speaking to a man in his late 20s or early 30s sitting 2 rows in front of me. "Sir, you need to put your seat back up. Sir." "Sir?" The guy starts spitting blood and convulsing. It sounded like he was choking on the blood with each gasp of air. Flight attendants start screaming for help and they make an announcement over the PA for a doctor. 4 passengers and all flight attendants leap into action. Turns out the lady in the row between me and the sick man is a nurse. Together they get him laid out on the row with his head in the aisle. He's not responding to their questions and he's fading in and out of consciousness. We make an emergency landing, 20 minutes ahead of schedule. As we are taxiing, he regains consciousness and tells the flight attendant holding his head that he's sorry for the trouble. We land. Paramedics meet the plane and carry him off. He seemed to be stable, but I hope everything worked out for the guy. TLDR. Guy sitting 2 rows ahead of me probably had a seizure and started choking on his blood. Flight attendants and a nurse in the seat behind him saved his life. Emergency landing and everyone made their connecting flights. I was on a flight home from South Africa after a family vacation. My dad is a diabetic, but he usually keeps his blood sugar levels pretty regulated, so I never worried before. Mid-flight, I wake up from a nap and see him slumped over the side of his seat. He was taken to the back of the plane, where 3 doctors were examining him. They said his heartbeat went up to 220 or something, which I think means he was an inch from death. All I remember is seeing my mom and brother break down. I began having flashes of life without my father, and it overwhelmed me. I felt sick to my stomach, imagining what life would be like, when all of a sudden his heart rate stabilized. The doctors on board said it was a miracle, and I felt so much relief. The plane had to stop in Senegal, where my dad was transferred to a hospital. He wanted me to keep going, since the semester was starting soon. That flight home alone was terrible. I felt the other passengers watching me the entire time. He is alright now, but every time I get on a plane I always remember that feeling of leaving the whole world behind. Date: the 11th of September, 2001. Location: on a plane 2 hours from landing in JFK, Nick, airport when the towers were hit. What scared the shit out of me was this flight attendant's face as she walked past me. This was before the pilot told us over speaker that we had to turn around back to Greece. I was just playing my Game Boy, wasting time, when I look up and see the flight attendants run past me with a face that looked scared to death. T has worried the shit out of me because flight attendants are always calmer than Hindu cows. So in my head I'm thinking, fuck, something might be happening, and just imagining the plane was going to drop any second. It freaked me the fuck out, but then the pilot got on speaker and said the towers were hit by kamikazes and we had to turn back. The entire flight back, the only image I had in my head were World War II style planes with Japanese kamikaze flying into the towers, and I was just wondering why the fuck Japan would attack us. The craziest thing that ever happened to me is pale into comparison to a dead cat. But here goes. I was flying Calgary to Houston, which is about a 4-hour direct flight. We were just about 2 hours into the flight, or coincidentally just about to Denver, when the pilot announced we would have to turn around back to Calgary. So around we go and land in about an hour 15. He really cranked on it. We touch down and taxi over to the mechanics. They opened the cargo door and shut it again. And in 15 more minutes we were fueled up and in the air and off to Houston. This time it was about a 3-hour flight. Full thrust the whole way. Luckily there was an industry guy behind me, and I overheard him speculating the reason. His idea was that since the airline had paid mechanics in Calgary, and probably not in Denver, it would be cheaper for them to turn around all the way to Calgary than pay all the costs associated with landing in Denver. Luckily it was just a little glitch, and not a true problem, but it was anyone's guess. The true issue. I have a friend that is very familiar with the inner workings of the plane, and he said that anytime they open the cargo door and unplug a certain cable during maintenance, some switches to be flipped to reset that alarm system for that door. He said it's an extremely common mistake for that switch not getting flipped after work has been done, and it results in false alarms. All that cost, likely in the tens of thousands, because one guy forgot to flip a switch. I wasn't there for it, but this happened to my cousin. He was flying in South America, and about halfway through the flight he realizes he really needs to take a piss. The plane he is on is a tiny prop plane made for tiny people. He is 6 feet 5 inches. He awkwardly climbs over his aislomats and shuffles to the back of the plane. As he is closing the door, the captain comes on the loudspeaker and warns of upcoming turbulence. He thinks, fuck it, I really need to piss. He crams himself into this tiny bathroom, manages to whip it out, and right as he starts to pee they hit a huge bit of turbulence that knocks him off his feet, backwards, through the bathroom door, and flat on his back, in the aisle, still peeing straight up in the air. He was completely mortified and managed to get back up, pick up the door and work himself back into the bathroom. He waited for like 20 minutes hoping no one would have seen it, forgotten about it by then. But when he went back out to take his seat he got a standing ovation from every single person on the plane. Ouch. In grade 12, I was on a band trip to New York and of course we flew there as it's a long ass drive from Vancouver. We were seated alphabetically, and the school band took up a good 10 rows of the plane. This also resulted in me and 2 of my friends sitting close together. Towards the very end of the flight, they turn to me and say that on the count of 3 we're going to throw our in-flight pillows at another mutual friend some 4 or 5 rows back. Pillows not being so aerodynamic led to only one hitting its intended target, and the other 2 hitting 2 other people. All 3 grabbed their pillows in addition to the ones we just threw, and chucked 10 back at us. Again. Only some made it all the way back to us, with others being hit and caught up in it. Eventually and spiraled so out of control that there was, for a good 5 or 10 minutes, about 9 pillows in the air at all times. The crew eventually made an announcement to ask passengers to please refrain from throwing loose items at each other. The teachers were pissed. But fuck that. TLDR started a pillow fight on an airplane. While waiting to use the water closet on the way to Panama, the door somehow opened while this guy was hunched over the toilet fapping away. There was no mistaking it. This guy looked like a poster boy for the Vinegar Strokes. At first I couldn't believe what I actually saw. As he turned his head to see the door come open, the most awkward eye contact moment of my life unfolded. He turned to shut the door in a panicked fashion, exposing his junk. At that point my WTF face became encrusted into my facial features for the rest of the flight and even the next day. So, since that time I can hardly use any bathroom on a plane. I'd rather just hold it in than see another buckache party. I was in an aisle seat on a flight from LA to Austin, TX. About an hour into the flight I noticed this awful smell. I look up from my book just in time to see this 70-year-old woman violently throwing up in her lap. Since I'm a sympathy vomiter, I turn toward the people in the other seats to try and avoid doing the same thing. After about a minute of this and the rancid smell of old people vomit, she is led to the bathroom. As she is leaving her seat, she shits herself in the seat. So I get to spend the rest of the flight gagging as this shit and vomit aroma rapes my nostrils. The flight attendants tried to clean it as best they could, but it made no real improvement. TLDR. Old woman throws up and shits herself on a flight from LA to Austin. I was on a flight to Chicago, was supposed to land at O'Hare, but about 30 minutes before landing they told us it was too icy and we were being diverted to Midway. Midway and O'Hare are 26 miles apart. So we land at Midway. We disembark, and as we are leaving the Skyway, a gate agent runs up and tells us we need to get back on the plane. They were now going to take it to O'Hare. We all said fuck it, we'll stay here. She then informed us our bags wouldn't be getting unloaded. We would need to go to the other airport to get them. So about 5 of us, out of a full flight 90, got back on and had to wait about 20 minutes to de-ice the plane. Then a 15-minute flight to O'Hare. TLDR. Saw a creature on the wing. throwing explosives in the engine. Attacked me. Totally freaked out. Dan Aykroyd drove me to the hospital. Flying from Atlanta to Washington DC. We were about 45 seconds post takeoff when the guy beside me unbuckled himself and started running up the incredibly steep aisle. The flight attendants immediately start yelling at him to sit down, even going so far as to fumble with the intercom. About 10 feet from the front of the plane, one of the crew said, "Flight lady. Sir. I'm going to have to demand you sit down." Guy. "Mom. I am going to shit my pants." Double quote. He barricaded himself in the bathroom for about 10 minutes and emerged to clapping and angry looks from flight attendants. He ordered a water with no ice in it when they got to our aisle. A guy died next to me once. On a flight from Maui to Dallas. I was half asleep in the second to last row of the plane. While I was listening to music and dozing, I suddenly heard a really loud, hard thud next to me. I look over, and there's a man lying on the ground, completely still. I thought maybe he tripped, but the flight attendant came running and he was unresponsive. She frantically ran up and down the aisles asking for doctors. Luckily for him, the flight was full of vacationing doctors and nurses, all of them in ridiculous clothes. 2 of the doctors who came back were in Hawaiian shirts and golf attire, and the female nurse who came back was wearing a very strappy, revealing blue Hawaiian print dress. The doctors tried to wake the man up, but he was gone. I was surprised to find out just how much medical equipment they have on commercial flights. The docs whipped out a portable defibrillator and shocked the guy, then set up an IV drip for him. I never heard a word out of him or saw him move. Not sure if he actually woke up or not. Our flight was diverted to LA, and when we landed half a dozen EMT personnel ran on the plane to pull the guy out on a gurney. Unfortunately for me, this whole scenario set off a panic attack, and I had to go find a nice spot in the aisle to lay down so that I didn't pass out and cause more problems for the crew and doctors. It was embarrassing. I was on a flight from Amsterdam to NY one time and there was a kid who was running up and down the aisles trying to bite people. As he was heading down the aisle at full speed, a stewardess suddenly pulled the refreshments cart into the aisle right in front of it and he ran smack into it face first. She said to him, "Oh, sorry. Didn't see you coming. You shouldn't run like that down the aisle." Or something like that. I know she did that on purpose. It was awesome. Flying from Nick to Boston on the Delta shuttle. About 20 minutes into the flight an odd smell is in the cabin. Smelled like burnt coffee grinds. I think nothing of it until the pilot comes on and announces, "This is your pilot and some of you may have noticed a stranger smell in the cabin." Well, we aren't sure what that is, so to be safe we're going down. Well, not the best choice of words, and he failed to mention the descent would be 3 times faster than normal, so it was loud as hell and the descent was steep. I wasn't too concerned, but I was amazed at how many people had religious items with them that were pulled out. One lady had an 8x10 metallic Jesus picture. I just whistled the whole way to Boston. I was on a flight leaving San Francisco Airport about 15 years ago. A mentally retarded man sat in first class a few rows in front of me. I don't think he understood why they wouldn't let him stay in his seat. He became frightened when the stewardesses tried to get him to move and curled up clutched the armrest. The airline called security in to remove him and they ended up tasing the guy and hauling him off the plane. When they tased him, he piss-shat himself and on the seat. So, in the end, the seat was vacant. This is less of a what the fuck and more of a fuck yeah experience. I traveled to England with a friend I didn't know very much. Long story short, she decided to be a crazy bitch and lie and lie some more. By the last half of the trip, we weren't even in the same cities. We had the same flight home, because we booked it beforehand. To my surprise, she changed her seat so she didn't have to sit next to me, a win in my book. The woman who decided to take the seat next to me was a flight attendant who was off duty. She was extremely cool. We talked for hours and since she knew all the girls who worked on the flight, she brought us drinks and food from first class the entire flight. Each person had their own screen to watch DVDs or whatever. Well, she had a card that she could swipe and it would give her any movie she wanted for free. So me and this rad flight attendant got drunk and watched Pineapple Express and laughed our asses off the entire time. I got so drunk I passed out and awoke just as we were landing back home. Best flight ever. We had snacks, drinks, movies and great conversation. The evil woman I went with would turn her head and disappoint, staring back at us. TLDR. Flight attendant sat next to me and got me free drinks, snacks, movies and food from first class. I was on a flight to the Dominican Republic on a fairly large plane. There was a really preppy family, most likely going to a mega resort, sitting right behind a large man who was clearly a native to the country. About halfway through the flight, the kids in the preppy family started giggling and I turned around to see them pulling on the large man's cornrows. The look on the man's face was something I've never seen before. He made the most perfect rage face and turned around and started yelling at the kids to stop. Prep dad told him something to the effect of "Don't talk to my kids like that." The Dominican man threw the most powerful punch I've seen in real life and sent prep dad falling back almost 3 rows. Nobody could believe their eyes and it was absolute chaos. Eventually the Dominican man got handcuffed by the marshal on the plane. But that was some of the craziest stuff I've seen. TLDR. Preppy little kids pull on a Dominican man's cornrows. Prep dad gets demolished. One time I was on a flight from Europe to Australia with a flight switch in Singapore. Each flight was 12 hours long, a total of 24 hours in the air. When we arrived in Australia we were told to stay seated as someone was taken off in a stretcher. Found out later that the person had died mid-flight. Another time my dad wanted to get rid of a glass he had so he could go to sleep, so he placed it on the seat just by him. The guy came back from the toilet and lay down on top of the glass and there was all this crunching as it broke under him, but he was really fat and didn't even notice it. But that was more funny than anything. Oh, I just thought of a third and last one. It was Christmas season. Flying to the States. I was looking out my window with my brother going, "We're still in the clouds. Wonder when we will start seeing the city," when suddenly the plane goes bam as it landed on the tarmac, giving me a huge fright. There was such a bad snowstorm we were unable to see out the windows. Hearing it is an emergency. Please stay fastened in your seat. Everyone on the plane went silent for a second while processing what was just said. As we were climbing from takeoff, a passenger left their seat. So the flight attendant got on to say, "Unless it is an emergency, please stay fastened in your seat." She failed to hit the button soon enough to catch everything. So it came out it is an emergency. TLDR. Flight attendant freaked the fuck out of everyone on the plane for no reason. Just as in for your information for cat owners, if your cat is panting, he's overheating and that's very dangerous. Sticking his face in front of a fan won't do much. You're better sticking cold items, cold can of pop, water, directly to the pads of their feet. As they don't have sweat glands, they can only cool off from the pads of their feet or their tongue. But the tongue isn't very large or practical to do much effect. If you're at home and this happens, stick them in the bathtub and run cool water so it's about a ½ inch deep. I have a lot of respect for flight attendants after one of my flights. I was on an international flight between Chicago and Germany. A guy next to my family kept asking for a drink. The stewardess initially told him he'd have to wait until he was in the air. Then she switched to not allowing him a drink at all because he was obviously drunk. The guy said he couldn't go that long without a drink. He wanted to get his bag because he had a bottle of vodka in it. The stewardess had a silver tongue and got the guy himself to suggest getting off the plane and passing up on the flight. That guy could have been a huge problem. But her diplomatic and compassionate handling of the situation was incredible to watch. My wife had a strange experience once. I guess it is more shitty than strange. But it's still strange. She had always had porcelain perfect skin until she gave birth to our daughter. Then she suddenly got really bad rosacea. Well, she was flying with our daughter to visit her sister and this crazy lady sitting next to her kept freaking out about her skin, saying, "She has a disease. I don't want to catch her awful disease." She was insisting that she moved to another seat, but the flight was full. The stewardess kept explaining that she wasn't contagious, that she just had an acne problem. But that dumb bitch wouldn't listen. It made my wife feel like crap, and everyone on the plane was laughing at that dumb lady. At least everyone laughing at the lady and consoling my wife made her feel better. I still wish I could have been there to punch that bitch in the face. I was flying with my 6th grade class on a class trip to Catalina Island, CA. About halfway through the flight, a nut job sitting right in front of me stands up and says, "Everyone better leave me alone. I have a bomb." Needless to say, I was freaking the fuck out. He seemed deranged. It was strange though, because the reaction from the flight attendants was very calm. They must be trained in handling this kind of thing. This beautiful flight attendant came up to him and just talked to him very calmly, telling him that he shouldn't say things like that with kids on board. "I shit you not," he screamed again. "I don't care. I have a bomb and I'm gonna use it." Passengers were doing their best to stay calm and ignore him. And after a few minutes I noticed that the flight attendant had successfully distracted him by making small talk with him. I think he was just a lonely nut job. Anyway, the coolest part was after the flight. As soon as the dude walked through the terminal, about 10 guys in suits just gang tackled the shit out of him. Fuck yeah. On a flight into Denver, my plane almost collided with another plane and then was struck by lightning. Full story. I was in the second row of first class. The ticket was bought at the last minute by my company. We were making our final descent into an apparently stormy Denver and the clouds obstructed our view out of the windows. At what seemed like only a few minutes from landing, the plane suddenly pulled out of its descent and began climbing again. The pilot came on the loudspeaker and informed us that we were coming in too close to another plane and we'd have to circle back and try again. Only a few turbulent minutes later, I actually heard through the cockpit door, "Pull up, pull up," and the plane climbed steeply back up to cruising altitude. I wasn't sure if anyone else had heard what I'd heard, but the flight attendant in the jump seat was on the phone with the captain, and she looked extremely distressed. Suddenly, out of nowhere, there was a thunderous crack and a flash of light that filled the plane. The woman next to me gasped and practically jumped into my lap, grabbing at me in fear. After 15 long minutes, we finally landed, resulting in cheers from the passengers. Taxiing down the runway, I saw several fire trucks racing across the tarmac. When we parked at the gate, the captain announced over the loudspeaker that we were owed an explanation. Turns out that after we pulled out of our initial descent, the pilot's controls lit up with a terrain warning, which later turned out to be false, but required the captain to gain altitude for safety's sake. Once higher in the clouds, our plane was actually struck by that lightning bolt we heard, and the captain declared an emergency to air traffic control, hence all the fire trucks. I got here much too late, but this was amazing. We were going to Vegas. While waiting at the terminal for a connecting flight, a couple came up while screaming at one another, "You need to stop being such a fucking bitch." "Oh yeah. I'm sorry I can't be a better goddamn girlfriend to you, you asshole." They went on like that, oblivious to the fact that everyone was watching them. When I got to my seat on the flight, they sat down right behind me and continued. A poor woman was stuck at the window while the fighting couple took the seats on the middle and aisle. They fought for most of the flight, acting like terrible people. It sounded like a breakup. After a certain point, they finally both shut up. "This is where things got weird," she said quietly and angrily. "What are you watching? Cake Boss? Ace of Cakes? Cake Boss? Ugh. I don't even know what that is. It's a cake show." Double quote. Silence continued for a few more minutes until the stewardess started down the aisle with fresh cookies. The hag's voice changed from constant rage to bubbly excitement. "I smell cookies." As we approached Vegas, she talked in the same giggly voice. "Oh, there's our house. So excited to be back." Double quote. It was as if the screaming of obscenities never occurred. TL. DR. A couple that was having a vicious fight turned on a dime because of cake boss inexplicably. Well, once I was flying from London to Toronto and I had a 3-hour delay. So once I finally got on the plane I was starving since I didn't eat anything during that delay. So I waited patiently for the dinner to be served. The food served wasn't enough. Well, the stewardess serving our seats was a South Asian lady who spoke English and Punjabi. I speak Punjabi well as my dad is Punjabi and mom Persian. So I don't look all that South Asian. So since I was still hungry, I asked the stewardess politely if there is something to eat as I am still hungry and my stomach was growling. She said no, there is nothing else available. I cursed my luck and sat back. About 10 minutes after, the person on my right asked the stewardess if there is like a sandwich or something he can have, and she suddenly changed the conversation to Punjabi and told him to wait 5 minutes, she will bring it for him. Few minutes later, when she was handing him the sandwich, she told him in Punjabi that tell the person next to you that you paid for the extra meal on board. I heard her say that and obviously understood each and every word. So I looked at her and told her in Punjabi I am willing to pay for it too. She was shocked and embarrassed. Got me a sandwich few minutes after. But I was very shocked. One time I won a free airline ticket and one of those radio promotions. I didn't think much of the destination, but I decided to go anyhow. It was quite an experience. Oh yeah. You know, I'd never been on a real airplane before and I got to tell ya it was really great. Except that I had to sit between two large Albanian women with excruciatingly severe body odor, and the little kid in back of me kept throwing up the whole time the flight attendants ran out of Dr. Pepper and salted peanuts, and the in-flight movie was Biodome with Pauly Shore and, oh yeah, 3 of the airplane engines burned out and we went into a tailspin and crashed into a hillside and the plane exploded in a giant fireball and everybody died. Except for me. You know why? Cause I had my tray table up and my seat back in the full upright position.